God. So again, Jacob, Rebekah, they took matters into their own hands when they thought God had closed the door on Jacob being the successor. Are there any other examples? Of course there are. Let's look at David, man after God's own heart. This is in 2 Samuel 11. 2 Samuel 11, verse 2. So here David's king. And it happened one evening, David arose from his bed, walked on the roof of the king's house, and from the roof he saw a woman bathing. And the woman was very beautiful to look upon. David sent and asked about the woman and said, "Is this not Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite?" And David sent messengers and took her. And she came into him, and he lay with her, and she had purified herself from her uncleanness, and she returned to her house. And the woman conceived, and sent and told David, and said, "I am with child." So you see, David has gotten himself into a pickle, hasn't he? Now, for David, he probably thought that God, maybe not God, I don't know, but that there was a door shut for certain for David, right? David was the anointed leader. He was the chosen one. And David was more than just a king. He was also the spiritual leader too. And he knew that his reputation could be tarnished forever. And you know, David had many machinations to try to get Uriah the Hittite to come home and be with his wife so that Uriah would think that this coming child would be his. So when Uriah stayed loyal to David, let's see what happened. And I'm sure David felt like he had laid the perfect plan. He had thought of everything, right? And he had said, you know what? I'm going to take these matters into my own hands. And really, let's see what David ultimately decided. We look at 11:14. And it happened in the morning, this is 2 Samuel 11:14, it happened in the morning, David wrote a letter to Joab and sent it by the hands of Uriah. Essentially, and think of the irony there, Uriah carrying his own death letter. And it wrote in the letter saying, "Set Uriah in the forefront of the hottest battle, draw back from him so that he may be stricken and die." And it happened when Joab observed the city, he sent Uriah to a place where he knew the brave men were. In other words, the roughest fighting. And the men of the city went out and fought with Joab, and some of the people of the servants of David fell, and Uriah the Hittite also died. He took matters into his own hands and had basically one of his most loyal, best soldiers killed, murdered, rather than face his own guilt, his own shame. He took matters into his own hands. Let's look at Saul. And this is in 1 Samuel 28:5. Saul saw the army of the Philistines. He was afraid, and his heart greatly trembled. And when Saul inquired of Jehovah, Jehovah didn't answer him, neither by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by prophets. Saul felt, and you can see here that Saul felt that God had shut a door. And so what does Saul decide to do? Take matters into his own hands. Well, let's take a look at that. "Seek me a woman who's a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." And his servant said to him, "Behold, there is a woman who is a medium at Endor." And we know her as the witch of Endor. And we read in chapter 31, the Philistines fought against Israel. The men of Israel fled from the Philistines and fell wounded in Mount Gilboa. And the Philistines followed Saul and his sons. They killed Jonathan, Abinadab, and Malchishua, Saul's sons. And the battle went hard against Saul, and the archers hit him. He was sorely wounded. Saul said to his armor-bearer, "Draw your sword and thrust me through with it, lest these uncircumcised ones come and thrust me through and abuse me." His armor-bearer would not, because he was much afraid. So Saul took his own sword out and fell on it. And the armor-bearer saw that Saul was dead. He also fell on his sword and died with him. And Saul died, his 3 sons, his armor-bearer, all his men, that same day together. All because Saul thought that God had shut the door. And he took matters into his own hands. So, how did it work? And we have one last example, Judas Iscariot. And this is in Matthew 26. One of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests, and he says to them, "What will you give me? And I will betray him to you." And they appointed him 30 pieces of silver. And from that time, he sought the opportunity to betray him. Judas thought that the Messiah would never crown himself king. He thought that Jehovah, God, had shut the door on the Messiah becoming king. And Judas says, "You know what? I am going to take matters into my own hands, and I'm going to force Jesus' hand, and will do nothing. He'll have to crown himself king." Judas took matters into his own hands. So in each of these examples, we see what happens when someone perceives that God has shut the door and they take matters into their own hands. It ends in disaster. Now, did God actually shut these doors in these stories? No. If you believe in a God of second chances, then you have to believe that God was not the one that shut these doors. Who closed these doors? Their hearts, the enemy, Satan. What about examples of those that trusted God? Let's look at 1 Samuel 1. 1 Samuel 1. And by the way, I forgot to mention, Judas ended up hanging himself, as you remember. So 1 Samuel 1. And we're going to read about Hannah. To Hannah he gave a double portion. He loved Hannah, but Jehovah had shut up her womb. So here is an example where the Bible tells us that God maybe had a hand in this. And Hannah's foe provoked her grievously in order to make her tremble, because Jehovah had shut up her womb. And as he did so year by year, when she went up to the house of Jehovah, she provoked her, and she wept and did not eat. And she was in bitterness of soul, and prayed to Jehovah, and wept sorely, and vowed a vow, and said, "Lord of hosts, if you will look upon me and the affliction of your handmaid, and remember me, and not forget your handmaid, but will give to your handmaid a man-child, then I will give him to Jehovah all the days of his life, and there shall be no razor come upon his head." So here, for Hannah, the door was shut to having a child, right? But when she gave her petition to God, he heard it. And they rose up in the morning early and worshipped before Jehovah, and returned and came to their house to Ramah. And Elkanah knew Hannah his wife, and Jehovah remembered her. And it happened, when the time had come around, Hannah conceived and bore a son, and called his name Samuel, saying, "Because I have asked him of Jehovah." So we see these instances here of somebody who trusted in God, and God opened a door. What about Joseph when he was in prison? I know I told the pastor that I wouldn't preach out of Genesis, but let's just think about Joseph for a minute. When he was in prison, could he have taken matters into his own hands? Sure. But he trusted in the Lord, and he became second in command to Pharaoh. What about Peter when he was in prison? He could have taken matters into his own hands. Paul as well, when he was in prison. What about Stephen? When Stephen was being interrogated, he could have taken matters into his own hands, couldn't he? But he stayed true. And when he stayed true, what was Stephen's reward? A vision, wasn't it? The Garden of Gethsemane. Let this cup pass from me, our Savior said. Couldn't he have taken matters into his own hands? Wasn't he also the Almighty? Praise God, he didn't. Last night at dinner, many of you know the Ben Carson story. And so our family, as you know, Dr. Carson, his mother required him to read a book and write a book report on it. So we've started doing that as well in our house. And Autumn relayed the story to me last night of a young man named August Pullman. You see, August Pullman was not born like other children. He was born without a jawbone, without cheeks. His eyes were set lower, without eyebrows, without eyelashes, without ears. When August Pullman was born, the doctor passed out. The nurse told the mother that he would not live through the night. The doctor told the mother he would not live through the night. And the nurse went to the mother and told her that with God, all things are possible. Amen. August Pullman, and he has the nickname Augie. And you can see him here. Here's Augie. After 27 surgeries, Augie lived. Amen. And you can see that he has a happy, loving family. And you can see him again here, further grown up. You see, Augie Pullman's story is an amazing story of a family that felt like a door was shut to them. And God gave them another way. His story is so inspirational that they made a movie about it called Wonder. And you can see he wears a space helmet because he doesn't want people to see his face. But Augie, and to this family, his story, and to now millions of others, is a story of inspiration and a story of God's healing. And it's also inspirational to those that read the book and those that see the movie. So God, when this family saw that the door for their son's future was shut, God had another way. Amen. At dinner time, my daughter Rebecca asked me, "What are you preaching about tomorrow?" And I says, "When God shuts doors." And she says, "Daddy, you know God's not going to leave you trapped. He's going to give you a window." And the more I thought about that, the more I realized that God is not in the business of shutting doors, only to stop evil from persevering. And as we've seen in the Bible, we can see that's true. That God is in the business of opening doors. And like my daughter Rebecca said, windows. Now let me ask you this. Why do you have windows in your house? It's so you can see the sunshine coming in, right? So you can see the sun. Creepy. So, don't you think Jesus felt like that doors had been shut to him? Remember his words on the cross? My God, why hast thou forsaken me?" You see, there's a lot of debate as to why Jesus spoke those words. And some people feel that maybe at that point, Jesus was dying the second death, that death where your soul perishes. And maybe perhaps that's why, because we know that Jesus had prophesied that he would be raised up. But at that moment On the cross, he spoke the words, "Why hast thou forsaken me?" You see, for Jesus, he thought that there was, he says the words, maybe in his mind, in some form or fashion, there was something was cut off between he and God. But we do know that that stone was rolled away, and not by human hands.
Amen.
That stone was rolled away, and again, our God is in the business of opening doors.
Amen.
Our closing song will be 3:30.